This episode is brought to you by ProMensal.
We notice this increased use of alcohol in the perimenopause because women just don't know what's happening to them. They're just finding they're feeling overwhelmed, they're anxious, they're not sleeping. So that one glass becomes 2 glasses, then becomes half a bottle.
Welcome to another episode of Thriving in Menopause, brought to you by Prevention Magazine. I'm Andrea Duval and I'm the editor of Prevention. For this final episode of the year, we're asking the question, are there secrets to an easy menopause? So who better to answer this than one of Australia's leading menopause specialists, Dr. Fatima Khan. Welcome, Fatima.
Thank you for having me, Andrea. It's an absolute pleasure being here today.
Fatima, most of our listeners today are here because they know that they're either perimenopausal or postmenopausal, but is it fair to say a lot of women just don't recognise when they're going through perimenopause?
It's a great question. The trouble lies when it's the perimenopause, it's the change before the big change, where the hormones are fluctuating and we're still having our periods, but getting all the other symptoms such as mood changes, changes in our weight, in our appetite, in our sleep, in our energy. And it's very difficult to pinpoint with a blood test or diagnose with any investigation. So there's a lack of awareness amongst women, but also there's a lack of education amongst healthcare professionals for recognizing, diagnosing and managing this phase of life.
So do you think that women sometimes go along to their doctors and it's misdiagnosed?
It's fair to say that I wouldn't want to use the word misdiagnosed, but I think what the healthcare professionals are doing is trying to treat the menstrual irregularities, maybe with a contraceptive pill, and treating the mental health side of the complaint with an antidepressant. So we know that 50% of perimenopausal women get treated or prescribed antidepressants, which isn't really the first line. It should be hormone-related and lifestyle factors that should be advised. But I guess they don't really understand how to manage this space because there isn't much healthcare professional education at medical school or even postgraduate unless you go and specialize further in menopause, which I have done, which is an extensive training at my own expense and time.
So, Fatima, you've been studying this area now for a number of years, and I'm interested to know whether there are new insights coming into play that allow us to now sail through this in a way that perhaps women weren't able to even a decade ago.
That's an interesting question. So obviously I have medical training and my mainstream of managing this phase of life is hormone replacement therapy, which is the first line and it's gold standard and very effective in managing these symptoms safely. However, over the years, I realized that there'll be some women when you give them HRT, they're still feeling quite ordinary or less than ordinary with the changes in mood, weight and energy and sleep. And it goes back to addressing the fundamentals pillars of health. So you've got to look at their stress management, their sleep, their social connections, their movement, what they're eating, and their mindset around this transition. And I think unless you address all those domains, women aren't going to feel their best and wanting to do the things they want to do. They're just not going to have the energy, the motivation, or the mindset to do that. So it's important to address all of those domains.
So perhaps you can share with us. Let's go through Dr. Khan's advice for a healthy menopause transition. Let's start with stress.
Yes, it's interesting. Stress is not just a state of mind. It's a physiological response where cortisol is elevated. You have a heightened sympathetic nervous system, which then has an impact on your heart, your blood vessels, your state of mood. You become more hypervigilant. Your sleep gets affected. We get more IBS-like symptoms, so the gut gets affected. So I think it's important to recognize all the stresses in the mind. There is a mind-body connection. It has a physiological effect. And we know that those high levels of stress exacerbate the menopausal symptoms. So night sweats get exacerbated, hot flushes, sleep disturbance gets worse, and then mood disturbance, so anxiety, irritability, all of those symptoms will be worsened with someone who's got higher levels of stress. So it's very easy for me to say, reduce your stress level. And that's why I call it, it's about managing. It's about recognizing what the triggers are, recognizing what you can do to minimize the impact of stress. We live in a world where we have chronic stress exposure at low grade. So short-term stress is great. It helps us get through difficult times. It's actually anti-inflammatory in our body as well. It helps us heal from wounds and any injuries. But now on a daily basis, we're chronically exposed to this low level of stress, which then doesn't help with hormonal health. And that's what will then create more negative experience during this transition. I think we generally don't have good awareness on how to manage stress. And the way we've done that conventionally in society is by either substance misuse, so using alcohol, because alcohol short term would relieve anxiety, but we know that long term it will disturb sleep, increase hot flushes, and make your anxiety worse. And we notice this increased use of alcohol in the perimenopause because women just don't know what's happening to them. They're just finding they're feeling overwhelmed, they're anxious, they're not sleeping. So that one glass becomes 2 glasses, then becomes half a bottle. But actually, it's long term more detrimental for your physical and mental health. The other things we tend to sometimes do is distraction. So we might spend hours on screen time watching Netflix. The Crown is very topical at the moment, and most women finding they're just staying in front of the TV watching that. The problem with that is the blue light exposure from that will again suppress your melatonin. You're not going to sleep. Or when we're tired, we find we're browsing a lot more on social media and Instagram platforms. And they're all fine in small amounts. So I don't think you don't need to eliminate them, although some women find that eliminating alcohol altogether helps them because their tolerance to consume alcohol is reduced. But I think it's just becoming more mindful and saying, okay, limit screen time after 7 p.m., try to have 5 alcohol-free evenings, try and put an Epsom salt bath in.
What does Epsom salt baths do for you?
So it's got magnesium in it. And so magnesium is very good as a muscle relaxant and will make you feel a lot calmer. And when we're very stressed, we consume a lot of magnesium. So a lot of women will then be depleted in magnesium.
Can we talk a little bit about food? Because you have some interesting views about the most beneficial foods to eat during this time as well.
Yeah, I guess the most common question everyone wants to ask is there a menopause diet? And unfortunately, the answer is there isn't. However, there's some fundamental principles that we want to keep in mind, and they are balancing sugar levels. So when the hormones are fluctuating, at the same time, if our sugar levels are fluctuating and we then get insulin coming in, which can make us store fat around the midsection. So with low levels of estrogen, we tend to become more insulin insensitive. And insulin is very important to clear away any excess sugar. And sometimes if it's not doing its job properly, it ends up storing more fat. So as long as you've got lots of insulin around, which is normally released after a meal, we will not lose any weight or burn any fat. And it takes on average about 5 to 6 hours for the insulin to go down after a meal. So the conventional rule of having breakfast, then another snack after 2 hours, and having lunch and having another snack, and then having, dinner like 7 meals a day, that doesn't necessarily work because you'll have elevated levels of insulin all day long. And so you're not in a fat burning mode. And that's where the link with fasting comes in. Fasting essentially works from 2 aspects. It's reducing insulin, so you're burning fat, but also you're limiting calories as well. So in the menopause, fasting can work post-menopause, so 12 months of no periods, because the insulin level is a bit more stable and you're not getting these fluctuations in your glucose because the hormones are pretty much very low. But interestingly enough, in the perimenopause, skipping a meal or prolonged fasting eventually ends up creating this restrictive binge cycle, and women will generally feel a bit more irritable in their mood, might feel that they're getting more hungry and they're feeling a bit dizzy and lightheaded. So I would normally recommend perimenopause. We recommend eating 3 good meals, which are heavy on cruciferous green vegetables, lots of plant sources, good quality lean protein, and good selection of fats. And if you have that in any plate, at every plate throughout the day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you'll be fine. And then limiting your alcohol and caffeine intake would add further to that.
Well, let's talk about caffeine. Can we talk about caffeine for a sec? Yeah.
Yeah, caffeine's interesting. I used to be someone who used to drink coffee before I went to bed, and that's how I got through medical school, by drinking 5 coffees every evening and staying up till 4 a.m. However, unfortunately, I can't do that anymore. If I have a coffee at 2 p.m., I will not be able to sleep that night. So we know that as we get older, some women will not clear the caffeine from their bloodstream, and there have been studies showing that we can have circulating caffeine for up to 12 hours in our bloodstream. So if you are going to have coffee, have it in the morning, don't have it after midday. The other trouble with caffeine is, well, it does to a certain extent mimic the same effect as stress. So you'll get adrenaline and sympathetic nervous stimulation, which then again puts your blood pressure up slightly, heart rate up. It's not unusual to get a bit of palpitation. So in someone who's already got a little bit of background anxiety in this phase, we're exacerbating all those symptoms. If you are going to have coffee, try and have it with food. If you have it with breakfast, you'll find that any negative impact is reduced, but majority of the women will be having coffee on an empty stomach, and then will have few hours before they have their early brunch or lunch, and they'll find that they're just a bit jittery during the morning and the day, and their mood is a bit volatile. So probably just go back and be mindful of, if you are consuming coffee, consume it with some food and try and limit to once a day.
When it comes to exercise, I think a lot of women feel overwhelmed by trying to jam it into a schedule that's already busy. What do you normally advise your patients?
I think there's 2 cohort of women. There's some women who are exercising every day and they're really good at it, but you've just got to ask them what exercises they're doing. And if they're doing a lot of running and lots of cardio, you want to shift that and change it to more strength training. So weight-bearing exercises to improve muscle mass, because we know as we get older, we lose muscle mass, and then our risk of falls is increased, and that's where the risk of fractures increase as we get older. So you want to do at least 2 to 3 sessions of weight-bearing exercises, lifting weights or body weight to strengthen muscle, and then also add in core exercises, so pelvic floor, core, back exercises, and clinical Pilates is very effective at doing that. So that combination is strength and then doing more specific core activity, which to strengthen that, because we lose that again as we get older, especially when it comes to bladder incontinence, which is common as we get older, but it can be improved with pelvic floor. And then you have the other cohort of women who just don't exercise. So, and those women, if you ask them, they'll do binge exercising because their association with exercise is for weight loss. So they'll exercise to lose weight, but they don't exercise for mental health or physical health. So I then try and change the narrative around exercise and say, do some movement, make it fun. You might want to do a bit of yoga. If you have lots of mood disturbance and finding stresses a lot, you might incorporate twice weekly Pilates and doing strength training. I can't emphasize the importance of building muscle. And that's a new concept for a lot of women, because we grew up in a generation where it was all about looking lean. But you have to appreciate that you need to lift very, very heavy weights to become bulky. So lifting low to moderate weights will not make you bulky, which is what most of the women are worried about.
One of the things that you also have on your list that I find intriguing is that you say, look after your mindset.
Yeah, so I guess you can't do any of the fundamental pillars of health if you don't have the right mindset. If you already have a preconceived idea that menopause is a terrible time in my life, I'm going to struggle with it, I'm going to have sleepless nights, and my mood's going to be worse, and also the society's expectations of women around this age is that they become a bit invisible, we're not relevant anymore. Well, if you're going to have that narrative, then your experience will reflect that. And we know that thoughts determine our behavior. So if you have a more positive narrative around this transition, you're more likely to integrate and incorporate positive daily habits, which will then serve us not only short-term during the transition, but also for long-term chronic disease prevention.
That's interesting because I love the fact that you talk about health span, not just lifespan. And then here we are at the midpoint and we have an opportunity to almost reset our health for the next half of the book of our life.
Exactly right. So consider midlife as a window of opportunity for a life audit. So whatever you've been doing in your 20s, 30s, 40s, just that's the past. You've got to stand where you are and have a diary and go through each domain in life and say, okay, what can I do to improve the quality of my life now? It's a short-term goal, but also long-term disease prevention. And so I always say that it's important to manage the menopause for two reasons. Short-term is quality of life, because the impact of the symptoms of menopause impact your daily life in terms of functioning at work, functioning at home, and in relationships. But also, we know it predisposes women to chronic disease. And women in Australia live till 85. So that's on average 30, 40 years post-menopause. But we know the main cause of death for women in Australia is Alzheimer's, dementia, followed by heart disease. The main cause of disability for women is an osteoporotic hip fracture. So if we are talking about prevention, we need to support women's brain health, heart health, and bone health. And if you don't address your food, your movement, your sleep, your stress, you are not going to be able to prevent those illnesses.
Interesting. So I guess knowing all of this, I have to ask, how's your own menopause been?
Yeah, I guess I went through a slightly earlier menopause, so that was interesting. But for me, I guess the main impact was on my mental health. I was someone who was always been very mentally strong, and overnight you develop this debilitating anxiety that comes from nowhere without any trigger, to the extent that I almost had some suicidal thoughts one evening. But I had quite good insight, and I still remember calling my husband and explaining this is what I'm feeling, but I was able to detach my thoughts and have this external person saying, okay, something's not right here, having done lots of women's health psych in the past. And so for me, I always say hormone health is mental health. And we know that 70% of the symptoms of perimenopause will be mental health related. For me, my brain fog was so bad and my memory was so bad that I had to cut my hours down to 3 days maximum because I just couldn't do my consultations. I couldn't recall diagnosis in words. And it was very difficult for me to diagnose that it was the perimenopause because with my PCOS, I've always skipped periods and had other things going on. And so it was misdiagnosed even by myself because I didn't have the classic hot flushes and night sweats, which we know 30% of women won't get. But it was only when I measured my estrogen, it was very low, and with other symptoms and the right help. So I guess it's important to note, for my lesson for me was that if you're noticing a shift in your mental health without any major triggers, you've got to see as to what's happening with your hormone health, because we know that estrogen is directly linked to serotonin, which is your happy hormone, dopamine, which is your reward system hormone, and low levels of estrogen or fluctuating levels can directly impact your mental health. And what we haven't talked about is cognitive health, which is memory, short-term memory recall, the ability to focus and concentrate, decision-making. I get CEOs coming to me and they'll say, oh, I've been doing this for 2 decades and all of a sudden I can't make decisions that I used to make in a nanosecond. So women start to lose confidence and self-esteem and having self-doubt kicks in. So you've got the cognitive symptoms and the mental health symptoms, and they're all in the brain. So the brain health is really, really important. All the symptoms of menopause start in the brain, including hot flushes, night sweats. A thermostat for temperature is in the brain. So for me, hormone health is mental health. And without mental health, good mental health, we can't really have great quality of life.
So, Fatima, if listeners are feeling, this could be me, but I'm not getting any traction from my doctor, what's the best thing to do? Are you able to ask for a particular blood test?
I guess the first thing I would recommend is to journal their symptoms over a 2 to 3 months period. So their menstrual cycle, number one, and also then monitor every day 4 domains. So how am I feeling today? So your mood, your energy levels, and your sleep quality. And a lot of women, when they start tracking, they'll notice around the perimenopause, their PMS symptoms, so premenstrually, the symptoms become worse. And they'll say, oh my God, I had restless legs, I couldn't sleep, I had terrible sleep, and I had more migraines, and I felt terrible anxiety and mood irritability 7 to 10 days before my period. And they can almost identify with those fluctuations in their cycle. If you're someone who's getting irregular cycles, and that becomes a bit more tricky. But unless you document what is it that you're experiencing, it's very difficult for healthcare professionals to identify that. That education is going out there and it is improving. But ultimately, we have to be self-advocates for our own health, menopause health, I guess. If you do a blood test, you can have someone with the estrogen, which is very high, and they get told, oh, everything's fine. So commonly you'll hear women saying, I went and saw my doctor did all my hormone tests, and they say they're fantastic, which is true because at that moment in time, they were great. But 2 weeks later, when you're probably experiencing symptoms, they're probably really low. And that's the trouble. They fluctuate every week, every 2 weeks. So you can't really identify on a blood test perimenopause. 30% of women will have severe symptoms of menopause and they will need some form of medical help. I would say 30% will have absolutely no symptoms. I have some women who say, I just didn't get any symptoms. I didn't even know when it came. And then everyone else is in the middle and they can optimize that by lifestyles and some need hormone therapy.
Is it a sort of case where the menopause that your mum had is likely to be an indicator of how it's going to go for you?
That's a really interesting question. So we know when it comes to early menopause, there is some genetic predisposition there. So if your mother went through an early menopause, the early menopause is defined menopause under the age of 40, so between 40 and 45. And if your mother went through menopause at 42, you're more likely to go through an earlier menopause. So there is a genetic link there. But there isn't much when it comes to the transition and how the experience impacts them. So if someone had terrible hot flushes and night sweats and gained a lot of weight and had sleep disturbance, that doesn't mean you will have that because the environment, such as our movement, food, sleep quality, stress, are major contributors to our transition. So I would say they're quite variable. And a lot of our mums in that generation, they would have had kids in their 20s. Their kids would have left when they turned 40, 45. So if they were homemakers and stay-at-home moms, they would be transitioning at home with fairly low levels of stress, more time to themselves, compared to now where we tend to have children much later, late 30, early 40. So my average 48-year-old will have kids, I would say there'd be 3 under 10. And then I've got the other cohort who are 55 and they are going to their children's weddings. So, it depends on where you had your kids and that transition is a lot more easier.
So in looking at striving for an easy menopause, what's the one thing that you want listeners today to take away from our conversation above all else?
Self-awareness. I think number one would be to be self-aware of the changes in your mental health, cognitive health, and physical health. And if you're able to track that and you're mindful of it, you're more likely to make the changes that you need to have a smoother transition and also to seek out the correct help. If you don't have that awareness, you'll find that we then try and use habits or integrate habits and go towards substances which are detrimental for our short-term and long-term health. And we're also then not going to get the right help. So self-awareness, self-education, and having a good healthcare practitioner that will support you on your journey is crucial. But, Andrea, the good thing now is I've seen a big shift. I don't know if you observed this, where the women who are perimenopausal in their 40s, they've basically said, we're not putting up with this and we're going to do something about this. And there's some wonderful open conversations amongst celebrities in the media. And there's so much community conversation where I think women are supporting other women. And when they're transitioning, they've got like-minded community. And with that becomes this positive social interaction where they feel like they're not suffering alone. And I always say, when we think we are going through something alone, there's a lot more suffering in silence. But when you know that there are other women experiencing similar symptoms, it becomes a lot more easy to cope with how we're feeling.
That is so true. And for listeners that are on Instagram, it's probably a good idea to follow Fatima, because you have some of the most inspiring tiles in my feed.
Oh, that's very kind.
So thank you, Fatima, and thanks to listeners for joining us for our last episode of the year. We'll be back with more great episodes in early 2023. But in the meantime, for more great information about living your healthiest life, don't forget to pick up a copy of Prevention magazine. I'm Andrea Duval, and I'll see you for a fresh new series with some exciting surprise guests in 2023. Bye for now.